Tim, how are you today?
Good day. Oh boy, I am having a wild Friday, but then again, get it all out of the way before the weekend. What do you want to talk about today, Merv?
Well, I liked our previous week's discussion, and that had to do with wasn't it to do with lessons learned and team expectations for working environments and that sort of thing. So just kind of
Let's,
coalesce around the topic of project responsibilities within a team. How's that?
that sounds good. That sounds good. Knowledge transfer, right?
Knowledge transfer.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
that'll work.
let's talk about that. And again, when you look it up in the exam content outline, it's funny because they don't just say lessons learned or knowledge transfer. They say knowledge transfer to ensure continuity of your project, which I scratch my head about sometimes. So maybe we can touch on that. But let's start off with a story, as we both like to do. Okay. Here's my story. I was in a consulting group, right? There were 30 of us project managers with about 300 engineers. And we launched a service that was consulting to major corporations around the world, Fortune 50s and Fortune 100s. And so for the next 7.5 years, that's exactly what I did. But they got organized within 6 months and said, here's our PMO, and we want you to capture lessons learned. And we didn't know how to do this. So we had a post-project review, and one of my buddies created the template for it. And on the template, he said, lessons learned. And nobody would contribute anything, right? You get to that slide and it was crickets in the meeting. Well, he and I and about 4 other people over a conference call decided to do something. What if we gave them an example of a lessons learned and what that looked like and would inspire them, sort of like trigger the brainstorm, right? And so we came up with one. If you ever fly to this city and have to work on it for a week, here's the best restaurant to go to. And here's the restaurant that's open at 11 o'clock at night. And here's where you don't want to be in the part of the city. And we thought it was silly until everybody started taking it seriously. These lessons learned were almost more important than the technology, right? The continuity of the work based on how comfortable people were working in their work environment. How do you like that?
I'd have never ever, I've done I don't know how many lessons learned, and what do they call them? Post-implementation evaluation reports, peer reports, right? So, but never once have I ever talked about what restaurants to go to at 11 o'clock at night. That's great. I like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, and again, this reminded me. I think about this when I get into when I'm teaching project management. I get to a point in the lecture series, and we start talking about the importance of lesson learned. And one of the slides says, "Here's the lessons learned of the deliverable. Here's the lessons learned of the project." And you don't forget either one. You want to improve the deliverable, but you also want to improve the project experience and how the people organize and get together to get the work done.
And so often, Tim, I've been on projects where they don't want to do lessons learned until the project is over. Well, a lot of projects that I've been on, I mean, I've been on projects that have lasted 4 years. Well, what do you remember from the project initiation process that you could possibly pass on to another group because you learned a lesson during? I mean, you can't. So why don't we start with some hands-on thinking in terms of, so what types of lessons learned do we capture?
Um,
Project knowledge.
I hope you know my answer by now, and the answer is yes. Okay, so I agree wholeheartedly with you. If people do not write down ideas, they're forgotten. That's human behavior, right? And
Yeah.
I think adaptive methods actually have it right, where they do it not just at the end of the project, but they do it you know, in an iterative fashion as they go through. You know, they finish up the iteration or they finish up the sprint and they say, okay, what did we learn? What did we do well? What did we not do well? And I really think that's the approach. But once again, you know, it's not just the deliverable and its work, but it's the cost management, the schedule management, the, you know, the all of the work involved, the supporting work as well as the creation of the deliverable.
Well, in fact, in the Agile process, don't they actually have a ceremony called the sprint retrospective or something?
It's
Isn't that?
That's what it is. And actually, if you look into the definition, a retrospective can be at the end of a sprint or at the end of a feature or at the end of a epic or even at the end of a release. And they leave it open-ended to where they say at the end, just like a stand-up is open-ended. It just says at the beginning, you know, and it works really well as a kickoff, but you know, it can be the beginning of the week, the beginning of the month, and so forth.
So in terms of what you were just talking about, what types of lessons learned do you capture when you do these retrospectives or reviews or whatever you call them?
So let's just go through the project life cycle, right? Planning.
Yeah.
Did we miss planning? Is there something that we skipped in that? Or is there something that we overplanned in that? Schedule, budget, cost, risk retrospectives, wonderful quality retrospectives. We learned a better, more efficient way of delivering something that people are more satisfied about, you know? It's more precise or more accurate. Hey, I learned to run this test in a certain way, so I only spend 5 minutes running the test instead of 25. Again, it's looking at the mechanism of creating the deliverable as well as the mechanism as going through the project life cycle itself. Some of my favorite lessons learned have been dashboard lessons learned, right? How can we take that data and convert it in such a way that we can use it to make better decisions? I actually was playing with TCPI, to complete performance index. And I figured out on a project with very little budget that, you know what, why don't I do TCPI on level of effort? And I don't have to play around with budget components. I can look at the amount of work, you know, in hours and days left, and the amount of time we have left, and it gives me my mileage, you know, and can I actually squeeze that much effort into that much time and make a more realistic estimate.
It's interesting because not long ago, the project that I'm helping advise on went through its own lessons learned process. And it's amazing when you really look back and say, okay, we faltered here, we had a hiccup here. What could have been done to prevent that? For example, one of the issues, or one of the issues we had was in UAT, we were uncovering a lot of defects that we thought we shouldn't be uncovering. And so we went back to look at the vendor's system test process and found some issues with the way they were doing their system tests. And so once we were able to clear that up, system testing was more thorough. We had fewer defects uncovered in user acceptance tests. So just something like that in terms of looking, where can I improve and what can I have done? What could I have done to improve it? Now, let me throw something else out to you as well, though. A lot of times in lessons learned, we focus on what went wrong. I think there's lessons learned on what we did well, so we should propagate those onto other projects, don't you think?
Yes. So here is the criteria. As a project manager, you need to focus on lessons learned, not the blame. Lessons learned, not the blame. This approach to actually communicating brainstorming, analyzing should be that. There should be a reward for how many lessons learned we generated, regardless of the number of mistakes. Here's why. If we actually use it as a blaming tool, if we use lessons learned as it's your fault or it's their fault or it's somebody else's fault, even that language is destructive to the continuity of the team.
Yeah.
So one of the best lessons learned I've found is actually having a section in communication management that says we need to be sharing information and nobody is right or wrong. We look at changing habits and behaviors, if anything. And the most valuable thing we can do is find out some improvement, and continuous improvement is the objective of looking at mistakes. That has to be job one when you're looking at capturing knowledge on a project.
And from my knowledge, from what I talked about earlier too, was continuous improvement can also come from those things that we did well. We may have fallen into something that we did well. Someone may have done a heroic effort to do something well to get us out of the mire, or whatever it is. But with those sorts of things should be documented as well. And by the way, Tim, I'm thinking that I agree with you. We don't want to use lessons learned as the blame game. But I'm wondering if we couldn't use lessons learned in the positive areas as a way to reward those who really came through for us.
Exactly. It's a time when we're discovering this. Again, in the team charter, how do we deal with mistakes? It's an obvious entry item into it. And it says, here's how we're going to look at a mistake. We're going to raise our hand and say, we made a mistake. Second of all, we're going to say how we fixed that mistake. Finally, we're going to say, here's how we're making or ensuring that mistake doesn't happen again. So mistakes happen. It's called human beings, right? But it turns lessons learned into an opportunity for a reward system, even in mistakes, because they are making an improvement that goes into the future, not just fixing what they did.
The other thing is, while we're still on this topic in terms of capturing those lessons learned, projects have a way of redoing history. But the whole idea of continuous improvement. And so one of the firms that I worked for as an employee at one point, we actually had a repository of project-based lessons learned that we could, whenever we were bidding a new project, we could look back at lessons learned from previous projects of similar types and apply those into our proposals. And often that helped us win the proposal, win the business, because people go, well, the people who are evaluating the proposal, they go, well, we never thought of that, but that's a great idea.
So in the current training content of the PMI project management prep, right, for the exam, they actually talk about a lessons learned repository, and they say it serves two purposes. Number one, it provides an opportunity for other projects to improve, but number two, it allows opportunities for the organization to improve also, where the organization can gather best practices and raise the value of their organizational process assets, not just increasing the value of projects.
And the other place that I used to go to lessons learned for was, when you're an employee and you've got a manager and you've got a whole bunch of staff reporting to you, and you have to do their semi-annual and their annual reviews to see if they're ready to promote or if they're ready to have a nice bump in their salary. Sometimes you could go to the lessons learned folder and say, I remember Jack was part of this. Cheryl was part of this. I can put that on their performance review and give them that little boost they need.
Exactly. It's an opportunity for connecting value add that you've learned from a project in as many ways. We think about this. Continuous improvement, we all learn when we go to school, Kaizen, right? You're looking for these small incremental improvements. That's great. But wouldn't it be great to, while you're looking for those small incremental improvements, finding as many ways to apply them where you're geometrically expanding the value just by, just by your approach to using them and implementing them. And that's what you're talking about here. That's great.
Oh, absolutely. So if I'm listening to Tim and Merv right now, say, okay, fine, that's good, but how do I collect lessons learned? Have you figured out any innovative ways, or are we just back to good old brainstorming?
Number one, I can collect my own, and I have my project journal. It's basically based on what I'm curious about, but I'm more interested in what other people think too, because I may overlook items that other people don't. It's let curiosity be your guide, and also engage as many different attitudes and minds into it as possible. And that seems to have worked really well. And it catches fire because people like to look at things they're curious about. It's their personal curiosity and their personal fulfillment by fulfilling their curiosity.
Well, the other thing that I found too is, as a project manager, when I do lessons learned, typically I'll look for those areas that either really went well or areas that needed improvement. But because as a project manager, I'm not necessarily in the details, I may make biased assumptions as to what truly happened, and therefore what's the mitigation for this not to happen again. So to have people from my team also provide their lessons learned, they give a different view of exactly the same thing that I just noticed. And perhaps it informs me as well, and therefore we come up with a different mitigation strategy for that kind of issue when it happens again, or should it happen again.
You're not just talking about a single line of logic then. You're looking at context, adding value to that collection of lessons learned. That's great.
Well, and as a project manager, if I think that I know everything, I'm truly fooling myself. And I'm truly hurting the project because I don't know everything. That's why we have staff in the details with their sleeves rolled up and really doing the work of what needs to be done.
So here's a question my students ask. Whenever I ask for anything that they've learned, I hear crickets in a meeting. How can I get people to step up and start talking? Because a lot of people, and I observe this too, a lot of people say that once one or three people start adding ideas, it sort of triggers ideas in other people, but getting them first to start that. What do you have any tricks for that?
I have a couple. One is that I'm working with a team now where we use a piece of software that we put out a couple of weeks ahead of the meeting where we discuss or coalesce on lessons learned. And that meeting is just like a board that you can go in anonymously and say, this is what went well, this is what could be improved. And by doing it in an online fashion, by the time the meeting arrives, I may have 45, 50 things on each of those columns that have been anonymously provided by those same people who don't like to speak up. Now, when I've got these lists here, and we also have a polling process, go through the list, find out what the top ones are, suddenly some rise to the surface, and now we can get illicit responses, and people then speak because they see it in front of them.
And they see more than one voice supports that one issue. And all of a sudden they say, hey, I'm not alone here.
Yeah.
Oh, good. I like that anonymity. I'm going to try that.
Yeah, and I wish the name of the product, there's probably several, but I wish the name of the product we're using would come to mind right now, but it doesn't. So, but I'm sure there are many. There's just kind of like retro boards that you can add information to, and then just do your retrospective or your lesson learned review that way.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
By the way, one of the thoughts though, while we're on this topic, in terms of getting the people together during that brainstorming session or whatever, one of the thoughts though is also is how to facilitate that. And I've seen it done a couple ways. One is as the project manager facilitates, but then that can also inhibit. The way that I found very effective is to bring in a facilitator, professional or not, but someone who knows what to do, who is independent of the project.
Ah,
And then there's no,
there's no
not,
judgment. There's no judgment.
yeah, so it becomes non-defensive, non-confrontational, because, you know, lessons learned, and you are talking about mistakes, perhaps, can arise, can cause defensiveness to arise. So you want to avoid that, because what you're really after is things to learn from to improve as you move forward.
Yeah. And on a long-term project, you have an opportunity to do multiple cycles of this and get people comfortable with that. It really is difficult to do it in a short-term project like for only 6 months, but still, you know, it's incredibly beneficial. My tricks mostly have to do with, you know, build it into this team charter and repeat those values and those norms in the team charter, and then reward when it's actually being observed.
Oh, exactly. But I think it's really important, as I mentioned earlier, and I can't stress this enough, especially for those first-time project managers or less experienced project managers, is to truly take the defensiveness out of any of this kind of situation.
Oh, yeah.
Because you're really trying to work this together as a team to improve as a team. And so that works much better.
Let's take a sidestep here, okay? Let's set lessons learned as a topic aside for the time being. We'll come back to that. But let's just talk about people who do not share information. You know, basically, if I know something nobody else knows, I'm powerful, right? I have a piece of power. How do you combat that in your project environment?
First of all, how do I know it's happening? If it's being hidden, right?
Right.
I guess it does come out in certain situations. So eventually, yeah, that's true. Eventually it will come out when you're in a meeting or something, and you'll go, wait a minute, when did you learn that?
Yeah.
2 months ago? Oh, I think it would have helped if we'd have known about that 2 months ago. Yeah, that's a good question. How do I get a hoarder of information to kind of cough it up? I like the thing that you just said a few minutes ago in terms of in the project charter, we kind of set those rules of engagement or rules of collaboration up front so that people know that there's no judgment. So that's one way I think that we can do it, is to make sure that people know this is a completely transparent environment that they can feel comfortable in sharing information.
The one that I found is more strategic. It's long-term and it's very hard, and it's winning them over by logic. You know, number one, the fact that information has a short shelf life. The fact that if I have a piece of information, I keep it to myself. In a quick amount of time, that information is going to become valueless. And then the second part of that logical chain is if I provide information, if I share information, it's going to inspire brainstorming, which now I don't have just one piece of information. I have the opportunity to become a constant flow of inspiration and brainstorming and knowledge. And that's much more valuable. But you have to do this over a more extended time than just putting some words in a charter.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. I think the other thing, though, is part of what you just talked about, is also let people know is that if they're the only ones with that information, then they're responsible for making that information work on the project. And suddenly they have nobody to share it with. And if it's way too involved, they can actually get themselves in trouble in terms of not being able to carry out the thoughts behind that. So
yeah, that's a horrible position to be in. And I feel sorry for my team members when whether they know it or not. I've had a few circumstances on big projects where somebody realized they had information that they didn't know was valuable for the project and they didn't expose, and it was like, oops.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could have needed that.
Well, and the other thing is, I was just going to use the word exercise. The other thing is, as a project, even before Agile, we used to do morning stand-ups. We used to just say, okay, what's going on today? What's happening? Where do you need help? Whatever. And the people who like to kind of shelter information and not share suddenly became used to other people always sharing. And so it became second nature for them to also share. They no longer became information. They no longer were information hoarders because everyone was doing it. And it just kind of became part of the natural progression of how the team worked together.
Yeah, and it's wonderful because that information sharing itself works as a mechanism for growing the maturity of the team. It's really weird how one thing you're trying to get the team to grow, and number two, you're trying to get that information to flow, and by doing one, it influences the other. It's really a sight to behold when you see these avalanche of positive results happening on your project.
Well, and let me take it one step further. We've been talking team. I like to think of my client, my stakeholders, my client team, my subject matter experts from the client side. I like to think of them as part of the team because we are. What about getting them involved in brainstorming, in lessons learned, in knowledge sharing? Does that work for you?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Stakeholders are defined as the people on the project who have information that they don't know is important.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
It's not holding them accountable, but actually teaching and mentoring them into a different mindset of being able to look at a problem in a certain way and turn around and say, hey, that's interesting. Oh yeah, that reminds me of something. And this is why communication is the primary way of engagement. And it's much easier to engage people who are interested in a project, because interested is an indicator of curiosity. And curiosity is a primary driver. I love getting people curious.
Well, and the other thing I noticed, I used the example earlier of system testing versus user acceptance testing. So think of the development team as doing system testing, and they think they're doing a great job. Think of the user acceptance testers, the subject matter experts on the stakeholder side, are saying, wait a minute, this isn't working like I expected. Until you see that knowledge share of their experience, you as the developer don't understand that you need to improve your ways. So having that second perspective is incredibly important on a project.
Yeah, and it's an integration activity. And that's something we have to realize, that when we come back to lessons learned and knowledge gained, it's not just cost knowledge. It's cost knowledge that has implications on the schedule and resource and the risk. It's risk knowledge that has implications on the stakeholders and the team and so forth. And so this is another thing that we just have to learn. It's not something that's written down in a book. Oh, it should be, but lessons learned and gathering knowledge is an integration activity. It's something that we have to take from a holistic viewpoint and say, oh, we can apply this here and here and here.
Oh, absolutely. And when you're trying to get something into a client's hands, especially in rapid-paced sprint development, you want those perspectives brought forward immediately so that each sprint works upon the previous one in terms of improvement and keeping going from there. Let's have a little fun. What's the craziest lesson learned that you have experienced in your vast numbers of years?
There's two. Number one, it was that restaurant one. Okay.
Uh,
We all laugh about it, but then you look at it and you take a second look and you go, hey, wait, there's something there, right? Second of all, tacit knowledge. Okay. Tacit knowledge. This was crazy. Okay. We were in a data center up in Oregon, and we were going through a tour of the data center. You go up to the third floor, you go to the sub fab, you go in and see the chillers and handlers, you see the racks and racks and racks, and then you go back down and you see the water and the cooling and the air conditioning and the heater and all that. And you pass certain rows, more than one time, maybe 2 or 3 times, right? And we went through one alleyway in the subfloor, and every time we went by, this tour guide kicked a machine. And he did it twice, and then finally one of my engineers said, why did we do that? Why did he do that? And the tour guide said, well, my boss, who was the data center manager here, he's moved on, just told me to kick it every time I passed by. And he didn't really explain what it does. He just said it works better. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, how are we going to expose that work better? And how can we get it into a checklist? Okay. And the thing is, that inspired me even more to look at lessons learned as a great body of work that says sometimes the greatest lessons learned are the things that people don't share because it's just the nature of the way they do their work. And so capturing lessons learned can be crazy, but they remind us, there's a lot of human behavior involved, and we can't just expect lessons learned to be handed to us in a plate.
Your restaurant, your restaurant example reminded me. So this goes years, and this was not a lessons learned, but I just have to throw this in because it reminded me. Years ago, I was working in the state of Michigan in Detroit, and it was an aggressive project. And there was times as a team, we wouldn't get out of the office until 2 or 3 in the morning. Well, by then we were famished. And so there was I'm not sure if they're still there, but there were some restaurants I think it was called the Ram's Horn restaurant, where there was an all night kind of thing. We could go in and get our eggs and just kind of talk about the day and just have, kind of let our hair down kind of thing. So that would have been, about 25 years later, I ran into one of my colleagues from those days. So we hadn't seen each other in 25 years. We saw each other at a Christmas party. He looked at me, I looked at him, and we both yelled, Ram's Horn, Ram's Horn. It was hilarious.
And
that's the kind of thing that just makes for project memories.
It's the culture. It's creating and embracing a healthy culture of a well-formed group. And that's part of what lessons learned does. We've been talking about capturing knowledge and doing it. We actually agreed on the fact that you have to do it if you only feel safe, and you won't do it otherwise. And so what we're talking about is it has to be part of a real healthy culture.
Yeah. And speaking of the craziest one that I experienced, and which probably was not as healthy a culture, we had buckets of dollars in our project budget. And one of them was to feed our staff, because your staff, when you're on a development project, people are in and out, and when you're young, you want to be snacking on something, snacking, all that kind of stuff. Our snack budget went through the roof, and we couldn't figure it out until we did a little bit of questionnaire and found out that one of the teams of developers, about 30 people, used to go into the snack cupboard on their way home at night and fill their briefcases so that they would have breakfast in their apartments the next morning.
Oh, wow.
And so we had to figure out a way to lock up and do something with the snacks so that they wouldn't, because our job wasn't to feed them on an ongoing basis. Our job was to provide snackies while they're working at the office. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
what about the most meaningful?
Let me think here. This is going to take a second. You want to go ahead first?
Yeah, I will. And I've probably said almost on every one of our podcasts, the reason that I call my company People First Project Management is because I learned a long time ago that the IT team is not the only team that's part of the project. And what I learned from working with advising client teams, stakeholder teams, was that often the vendor teams, the IT teams, would not treat them very well. And I found through kind of experimentation and working with IT teams who were not treating their client staff very well, we changed that whole dynamic. And the lesson we learned was the incredible increased productivity that came as a result of the client team becoming equal to the development team. And so
Wow.
from that came People First Project Management. And I still, in any kind of project I work on, I want to make sure that everyone on the team, from the person who answers the phones at the front desk to the person who is in the stakeholder management office, everyone is equal. They may contribute differently, but they're all equal. So that's one of the huge lessons learned that I picked up on and have been able to use for ongoing projects to make them better.
Here's the one that was the most meaningful. We are up in the Pacific Northwest and working on a data center project. And three of us, it was actually a small team. It was just 8 or 9 of us. And 3 of us were project managers. And we were walking from the parking lot to the restaurant. We were going to have dinner together that night. And 2 of us started talking about, being part of that team. You know what that team is, right? The people who click, the people who are able to perform, and the people who just naturally function. And we were talking about that, and we were talking about the fact that, that's what this data center project was turning into. And how could we do that better? And how could we make or create an opportunity for that team to emerge? And that conversation and that experience of observing an early point in the emergence of a highly functional team actually inspired me to play with the aspect of getting through into performing, and what can I do as a leader influence a team to actually not just get to a performing level, but perhaps stay a little longer there than normal. And that actually has led to a lot of learnings that I've had working with groups of people like you. It's all about the people, the results, the engagement, the productivity, all of that are connected to human behavior and how humans work best as a group.
Well, and even part of what you just described was part of that is how do we in fact form a team? Because imagine having an entire team, let's say your team is 100 people, and they're all introverts. They're all green eye shades people. Imagine you would lose a lot of productivity because people would, yes, be heads down, but you would lose a lot of the collaboration. But what if you had a team of all gregarious people who just basically like to sit around and throw paper wads at each other and just have fun? Again, so you want to be able to use a lesson learned like that to be able to bring in a good project mix of not only the skills you need in the project, but also the personalities that can mix and work together.
Projects and project teams are like steam engines. A steam engine, you have to have enough pressure for the wheels to go, but too much pressure and the engine blows up. And it's a real art form to actually create that environment. Now, what's interesting is we started off this conversation today talking about knowledge transfer and capturing lessons learned. And we were using that as an indicator of a fully functioning team. Do you really think that we can use this knowledge management and lessons learned as a leading or maybe a following indicator of a functioning team?
Well, I think both. And I'll tell you, from my early experience, I used to work for a company that this was back when it was the wild, wild west of computing, when people didn't really understand projects. They just knew they had to get something done and into the hands of their end user. And I worked for a company that decided they were going to put a lot of work around project management methods. And we developed our own project management processes, our own project management situations. That came from not only lessons learned, but we began to develop a set of templates, a set of sample deliverables, the kinds of things that you can use to spur a new project forward, because they have something to work from. So that's one example that I can think of, that yes, it is both a leading and an objective of the project that you're trying to get done.
Excellent.
How about yourself?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, there's a direct correlation. People feel comfortable. And it's an indicator of how much information they share when they feel comfortable. And when they feel comfortable, they're more productive. And how can we actually create that so that it's semi self-sustaining, but at the same time, we can step in and help influence the focus of that energy that's created due to that sense of comfort as a group.
So again, it doesn't have to come from within the project that you're conducting. It could come from many, many areas. And I think we started off also talking about a knowledge base that's organization-wide, not just project-wide.
Mm-hmm.
So that knowledge base can also contribute to an impetus on our project to do things well.
Yeah. We've been talking about best methods and lessons learned all the way through that. And it's sort of a self-referential discussion, but everything we've talked about and what we know came from either an organizational knowledge base or our own experience or a combination of those.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, exactly. I remember one time we were working on a project and we had someone from a completely different industry. It wasn't even IT related, but that person had experience in a whole different management style, management process. And they brought some lessons learned that we hadn't even thought of. So it can come from anywhere.
Yep. Staying curious is the way that we can capture these things that we're not generally aware of, but is always around us. Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. So if you were to advise a project manager just getting started in their career to influence the ability to capture lessons learned and use lessons learned on project, what would you tell them?
We've done this several times. Get a mentor who does this well, and watch what that mentor does. If you're working on a project where you have a seasoned project manager, that seasoned project manager should be at the point where they're capturing and using knowledge base that comes from elsewhere, from lessons learned or whatever. Tie yourself at the hip with that person and watch how they conduct themselves and watch how they use information gleaned. So that's one way that I can think of, is, again, through the mentorship process.
Yep. Also, investing in a strong team charter that's that you refer to on a regular basis. And also build into your plan milestones to do these retrospectives and stand-ups so you can gather this knowledge at the moment it occurs, if you can, so people don't forget the details, and also other people around them are triggered by their brainstorms.
Well, here's the important thing. I never thought of this until you mentioned that. During those retrospectives and during those stand-ups, don't just get immersed in the details of the project. Get immersed in the process and watch how it's happening. Watch what works and watch what doesn't work. And then you, as the mentee, as the person who's learning to do this, apply those when it's your turn as a team lead, as a project manager, or just as a contributor to those retrospectives or those stand-ups.
Indeed.
The other thing I thought of, Tim, is if you are the mentor, let the mentee make mistakes.
And create, it's much like being a parent. Create an environment such that they're allowed a little bit of autonomy,
Yeah,
yet they don't have so much autonomy that it hurts the environment.
right.
Get that balance and let them experience a little beyond their skill set. It may not be perfect results, but I tell you, the investment in that and giving up a little bit of control as a leader guarantees, number one, people will look to you as a leader. Thank you, for doing this for me. And number two, it allows them to stretch and realize that there's opportunities for growth in just in project after project after project. And that's what I found too, that I have, I'm very pleased with my record. I've had as many failures as anybody else has, but I've learned that actually taking care of the human components of a project, I have a lot of mistakes, but at the same time, the successes seem to be celebrated a little bit more.
They are. And I once had a mentor who told me that if you are right, or if you are successful, 60% of the time you're ahead of everybody.
Oh, yeah.
So that, just from me, that was encouraging. And I think the last thing I would want to throw in here, if I'm a newly minted project manager looking to understand transfer of knowledge and lessons learned, I would ask my mentor, I would ask my project manager to give me a little bit of that leeway so that I can learn from that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we can do and just kind of put our necks out there and just say, I don't want to fail at this, but I do want to be stretched.
Yeah. And finally, getting back to lessons learned, you said something just a couple minutes ago that triggered me. One of my favorite comments in philosophy is the human brain wants victory, not truth.
Huh. Excellent.
And the thing is, with lessons learned, it's all about truth. It's all about learning more, and the satisfaction and the rewards you get from exposing yourself and growing into something that you didn't think you could be able to do before.
Well, I think we've exhausted this topic, at least at this level.
Yes, we have. Yes, we have.
And I'm ready to go back to my project and do some lessons learned.
I'm going to be writing some notes for future shows, indeed.
Yeah.
Thanks again. So where can we actually contact you and talk to you if we need to bounce some ideas off you?
I love LinkedIn. In fact, I was on there probably every morning this week. I try to do at least 15 minutes every day, at least. And I find that at least gives me an opening. You don't need to spend a lot of time, but if someone's got some interesting conversation, I will definitely spend more than those 15 minutes. But yeah, find me, Merv Jersak on LinkedIn.
Very good. And again, I'm Timothy Jerome out at LinkedIn too.
So until we meet again, let's just call this one a day.
Thanks again, Merv. Looking forward to our next conversation.
You too. Thanks.